On April 11, 1952, in Paris, France, a conference room filled with generals, admirals, and defense strategists from several Allied nations waited as one of the most respected commanders of World War II stepped forward to speak. At the podium stood Dwight David Eisenhower, the former Supreme Allied commander who had led the massive D-Day invasion only 7 years earlier and who would soon become President of the United States. The audience expected him to discuss the future of warfare, perhaps nuclear weapons, jet aircraft, or powerful naval fleets. Instead, Eisenhower surprised everyone by focusing on something far simpler. He began speaking about a steel tube. According to Eisenhower, the bazooka was one of the 4 tools that helped secure victory in World War II. He placed it alongside the Jeep, the C-47 transport aircraft, and even the atomic bomb. At first, the comparison sounded almost unbelievable. On one side was the atomic bomb, a weapon powerful enough to end the war in the Pacific with 2 blinding explosions. On the other side was a shoulder-fired launcher that cost only about $25 to produce. Yet Eisenhower believed both belonged on the same list. Interestingly, German commanders might have agreed with him, though for very different reasons. By 1944, German armored forces had discovered that the battlefield had become far more dangerous than before. In the hedgerows of Normandy, inside the ruined towns of Italy, and among the frozen forests of the Ardennes, Allied soldiers were carrying a weapon capable of destroying a tank in seconds. Small 2-man teams armed with bazookas could hide almost anywhere, behind walls, inside damaged buildings, or along roads covered in rubble. Suddenly, the battlefield became unpredictable for German tank crews who had once advanced across Europe with confidence. Earlier in the war, German armored divisions had swept across Poland, defeated France in only weeks, and pushed deep into Soviet territory. Their tanks had dominated the battlefield and terrified enemy infantry, who had almost no way to stop them. But by 1944, the situation had changed dramatically. A weapon small enough to be carried on a soldier's shoulder could now destroy a heavily armored vehicle worth thousands of dollars and weighing many tons. Imagine the situation from the perspective of a German tank commander. You are sitting inside a massive Tiger tank surrounded by thick armor and controlling one of the most powerful cannons on the battlefield. Your vehicle weighs nearly 60 tons and is designed to dominate any opponent. In theory, you should feel almost invincible. Yet despite all that steel and firepower, you know that somewhere nearby there could be a single infantryman waiting quietly with a rocket launcher resting on his shoulder. Hidden behind a wall, crouching in grass, or lying silently in the snow, he carries a simple 5-foot tube that weighs less than many rifles. If he manages to approach within about 100 yards, your enormous armored vehicle could become a burning wreck in less than 3 seconds. That possibility forced German tank crews to move cautiously in ways they had never done before. Every ruined building looked dangerous. Every window might hide an ambush. Every pile of rubble could conceal a soldier with a bazooka. This dramatic shift in battlefield power raises an important question. How did such a simple and inexpensive weapon manage to change the rules of armored warfare? How did something that looked so basic compare with tanks and artillery become powerful enough to challenge one of the most advanced armies in the world? To understand that story, we must travel back to the spring of 1942 when 2 men arrived at a testing ground carrying a strange prototype they had assembled earlier that same day. Their invention would eventually transform the way infantry soldiers fought tanks. But before reaching that moment, it is important to understand the problem they were trying to solve. In early 1942, the United States Army faced an uncomfortable truth. American infantry soldiers had almost no reliable way to stop an enemy tank. Imagine lying in a foxhole while a 40-ton armored vehicle moves toward your position. Its machine guns sweep the ground, and its cannon begins turning in your direction. What can you do? If the most powerful weapon you carry is a standard rifle, the answer is almost nothing. Rifle bullets cannot penetrate tank armor any more than raindrops can pierce steel. When the United States entered World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, American ground forces possessed very few portable anti-tank weapons. Tanks had already proven themselves to be one of the most dominant forces on the battlefield. German armored divisions had demonstrated their power by rapidly conquering large parts of Europe. Meanwhile, the average American infantryman had little more than determination when facing those machines. Other nations had tried different solutions, but many were ineffective. The British used the Boy's anti-tank rifle, a heavy weapon weighing more than 30 pounds that struggled to damage newer German tanks. The Soviets relied on the PTRD, a large rifle firing a powerful 14mm round, but its recoil was brutal and its effectiveness limited. In reality, these weapons were not true solutions. They were desperate attempts to give infantry some chance against tanks. American doctrine reflected this weakness. If enemy tanks appeared, soldiers were instructed to call for their own tanks or anti-tank guns. If those were unavailable, they might attempt to use grenades. If the enemy was too far away, retreat was often the only option. This reality created enormous pressure for American engineers to find a better answer. The United States was preparing to send millions of soldiers overseas, and every day without a solution meant greater danger for those troops. In 1942, at a facility in Indian Head, Maryland, two men began working on a new idea. One was Colonel Leslie Skinner, an experienced ordnance officer who had spent years studying rocket technology. The other was his assistant, Lieutenant Edward Ewell, a young engineer only 24 years old who had recently graduated from Lehigh University before joining the Army's Ordnance Corps. Their task was simple but difficult. Design a weapon that would allow a single infantryman to launch a shape-charged warhead capable of penetrating tank armor. The warhead already existed in the form of the M10 shape-charged grenade. The challenge was finding a way to launch it effectively. The grenade weighed more than 3 pounds, making it impossible to throw far enough to remain safe from the explosion. Firing it from a rifle would produce recoil strong enough to damage the weapon. Many traditional ideas had failed. Then inspiration appeared in an unexpected place. According to Edward Ewell, he was walking past a pile of scrap metal when he noticed a simple steel tube that was almost the same diameter as the grenade they were trying to launch. That observation sparked an idea. Instead of throwing the grenade or launching it from a rifle, why not turn it into a rocket and fire it from a tube resting on a soldier's shoulder? Using parts nearby, Skinner and Ewell quickly built a rough prototype made from a steel tube, a wooden rifle-style stock, and improvised grips. To test it, they aimed toward the Potomac River and fired. The rocket shot forward with a loud whoosh and almost no recoil. In that moment, you'll realize they might have discovered a weapon capable of changing the battlefield forever. The rocket itself produced so little exhaust that it didn't require any protective gear at all. A soldier could simply rest a launcher on his shoulder and fire it as naturally as pointing a finger. However, creating a prototype inside a small workshop and convincing the military to mass produce it were two completely different challenges. In 1942, the American military system was massive, highly bureaucratic, and extremely skeptical of ideas that didn't come from high-ranking officers. Skinner and Ewell were not famous inventors or decorated generals. To many people, their launcher looked more like a piece of plumbing than a serious weapon. Yet on May 6, 1942, they were finally given a chance to prove themselves. The Army arranged a demonstration at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. The event was mainly meant to display several anti-tank Spigot mortars, heavy and complicated British weapons that weighed over 100 pounds and required trained crews to operate. Senior officers and generals were attending the test, expecting to see advanced and sophisticated military technology. In contrast, Skinner and Ewell arrived carrying a simple metal tube. The launcher they brought had actually been assembled using basic materials found around the testing site itself. There was one detail about that weapon which might sound amusing at first, but becomes very important later. The launcher had no sights at all. During the rush to prepare for the demonstration, nobody had remembered to install a proper aiming system. So on the morning of what would later become one of the most significant weapons demonstrations in infantry history, Edward Ewell quickly improvised a sight using nothing more than a wire coat hanger. With a pair of pliers, he bent the hanger into shape and attached it to the tube, creating a crude but functional aiming device. The demonstration then began. 5 different Spigot mortars were fired at a moving M3 Stuart tank positioned about 150 yards away. Their crews struggled with the complicated sights and the heavy equipment. The weapons were difficult to maneuver and slow to adjust. The watching generals observed carefully as each team attempted to hit the moving target, but not one of those large mortars managed to strike the tank. After that, Yule stepped forward with his simple launcher. He later said that he wore a welder's mask during the first shot because he was worried about a possible dangerous backblast. As it turned out, there was none. He calmly rested the tube on his shoulder, aimed through the makeshift coat hanger sight, and pressed the trigger. The rocket shot forward with a loud whoosh, leaving a thin trail of smoke behind it, and slammed directly into the side of the tank. Only 5 seconds later, Yule reloaded and fired again, striking the tank a second time. Among the observing officers was Major General Gladion Barnes, the head of research and engineering for the Ordnance Department. Barnes walked over, inspected the launcher, and reportedly made a simple comment that would become historic. He said the weapon looked like Bob Burns' bazooka, a homemade musical instrument used by a popular radio comedian at the time. The nickname immediately stuck, but the name was not the most important outcome of that day. What truly mattered was the reaction of the Army leadership. The results of the demonstration quickly reached General George C. Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the United States Army. Marshall instantly understood the significance of what he was seeing. This was not merely another weapon. It represented a major shift in infantry warfare. He immediately ordered 5,000 launchers to be produced. Production contracts were awarded to General Electric's factory in Bridgeport, Connecticut on May 20th, 1942, and within weeks the assembly lines were already operating. The numbers themselves tell the story of how practical the design was. Each M1 bazooka required only about 20 pounds of steel, simple welding work, and a few electrical components. The total cost of one launcher was only $25. A factory worker could assemble a complete unit in roughly 2.5 hours. There were no rare metals, no complicated machining processes, and no expensive materials involved. In fact, almost any factory capable of producing household appliances like water heaters could manufacture bazookas as well. The rockets themselves, known as M6 rounds, cost around $8 each. 2 small dry cell batteries located in the wooden shoulder stock were used to provide electrical ignition for the rocket. The overall design was surprisingly straightforward. A seamless steel tube 54 inches long and about 2.36 inches in diameter, weighing only 13 pounds. Captain Franklin Johnson, a training officer at Fort Benning, wrote in an official report that soldiers could learn to use a bazooka effectively in just a single afternoon. In comparison, mastering a traditional 37mm anti-tank gun required weeks of training. Even more importantly, 2 soldiers carrying a bazooka could move anywhere ordinary infantry could go. They could climb mountains, move through forests, enter buildings, cross rivers, or travel across rough terrain. Anywhere a soldier could walk, he could now bring with him the ability to destroy an armored tank. That had never been possible before in the history of warfare. By October 1942, only 5 months after that improvised coat hanger demonstration, factories were producing roughly 5,000 bazookas every month. The journey from a scrap-built prototype to large-scale wartime production had taken just 5 months, an incredible pace driven by the urgency of war. However, the story almost took a disastrous turn at this point. Producing thousands of launchers meant nothing if the soldiers who carried them into combat had no idea how to use them. And unfortunately, that was exactly what happened. The bazooka's first appearance in battle nearly became a catastrophe. The weapon that would eventually shock German forces almost destroyed American confidence before it ever had the chance to prove itself. The problem involved sealed supply crates, a worried general, and a tense night that Dwight Eisenhower would never forget. To understand what happened next, we need to leave America behind and travel across the Atlantic Ocean to the beaches of North Africa. On November 8, 1942, during Operation Torch, more than 100,000 American and British troops prepared to launch the largest amphibious invasion the Western Allies had attempted so far. As General Dwight Eisenhower reviewed the final preparations aboard a warship in the Mediterranean, he received shocking news. None of the soldiers in the invasion force actually knew how to operate the bazooka. 5,000 M1 launchers had been delivered to the troops in sealed wooden crates marked secret, with strict orders not to open them until the invasion began. No training manuals had been included, no instruction sheets, and no diagrams explaining their use. Thousands of brand new weapons had been shipped to the battlefield, yet not a single soldier had ever fired one before or even seen one up close. Imagine being one of those soldiers, only 19 years old, standing on the deck of a ship heading toward an unknown battlefield, surrounded by sealed crates containing a weapon that might save your life, but no one has any idea how to use it. Imagine being a young soldier, barely 19 years old, preparing to step off a landing craft onto a hostile beach in North Africa. It is your very first battle, the first time anyone might shoot at you with real bullets. In the middle of that chaos, someone hands you a strange 5-foot metal tube you have never seen before and simply says, "This stops tanks. Figure out how to use it." That was the reality many American soldiers faced during the invasion. While the landing against the Vichy French forces went fairly smoothly overall, the bazooka's first appearance in combat was dangerously close to a disaster. Under enemy fire, soldiers opened sealed wooden crates and tried to understand how the unfamiliar launcher worked. To make matters worse, many of the early M6 rockets had been damaged by moisture during the long sea journey across the Atlantic. Some rockets refused to fire at all, while others malfunctioned or exploded too early. The 509th Parachute Infantry Regiment later reported that out of the first 20 rockets they fired in combat, only 7 actually worked as intended. That meant a failure rate of around 65%, a terrifying statistic when your life depends on the weapon in your hands. Even in the middle of that confusion, there were small signs that the new weapon had real potential. The combat log of the 1st Armored Division on November 10, 1942, included a short but revealing entry. It stated that an anti-tank team had destroyed 2 Vichy French Renault tanks using the new rocket launcher near Port Lyautey. The report concluded with a simple observation: the weapon was effective when functioning properly. Those 3 words, "when functioning properly," capture both the promise and the problem of the bazooka. The concept clearly worked. Infantry soldiers now had a weapon capable of destroying armored vehicles. But the system still required better rockets, improved reliability, and proper training before it could reach its full potential. Unfortunately, the U.S. Army was about to learn those lessons in the harshest way possible. Only 3 months after Operation Torch, American forces would suffer one of the most humiliating defeats in their history. And during that defeat, the Germans would capture a weapon that would influence the war in ways no one expected. The moment came on February 14, 1943, Valentine's Day. Instead of romance, the U.S. Army received one of the worst shocks in its history. At a rugged mountain pass in west-central Tunisia known as Kasserine Pass, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the famous Desert Fox, launched a powerful attack with his experienced Afrika Korps against American troops who had been in the war for barely 3 months. The Americans believed they were ready for battle. In reality, they were not prepared for the skill and experience of the German forces. A soldier named Dominic Martel from the 39th Infantry Regiment of the 9th Infantry Division later described what happened. His unit had been ordered to hold its position no matter what. Soon German Panzer IV and Tiger tanks, machines far superior to most American armored vehicles at the time, smashed into their defensive lines. The situation quickly turned desperate. The American soldiers ran low on ammunition, then food, and eventually even water. On February 18th, Martel was captured, becoming one of the first American prisoners of war taken by Germany in the North African campaign. He would spend more than 2 years in captivity. Decades later, he would say that sometimes it felt unreal, as if the entire experience had been a nightmare rather than something that truly happened. But it had happened, and the results were devastating. During 6 days of fighting, the U.S. Second Corps suffered heavy losses. More than 6,000 soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. They also lost 183 tanks, over 200 artillery guns, and more than 500 trucks and vehicles. German casualties were far lower, fewer than 1,000 men. The imbalance was shocking. General Omar Bradley later described Kasserine Pass as the worst performance in the history of the U.S. Army. Yet hidden within the wreckage of that defeat was a detail that would change the course of the story. When Rommel's troops captured American positions near Sidi Bouzid, they seized large quantities of abandoned equipment. Among that gear, German intelligence officers discovered something unusual: 5 intact M1 bazookas along with around 20 M6 rockets. The irony was remarkable. A weapon designed to help American infantry destroy German tanks had ended up in German hands because the soldiers carrying it had been overwhelmed before they could properly use it. Some of those troops had received their bazookas only 2 days before the German attack began. They had barely any time to learn how the unfamiliar weapon worked before facing veteran tank crews of the Afrika Korps. The captured launchers were quickly sent back to Germany for analysis. On February 28, 1943, they arrived at the Wehrmacht's weapons testing facility in Kummersdorf. German engineers carefully disassembled the launchers and studied every component. Their report, preserved in military archives, described the American rocket launcher as a remarkably simple and effective solution for infantry anti-tank warfare. The weapon weighed about 6 kilograms, required minimal industrial resources, and could penetrate approximately 80 millimeters of armor at a distance of 100 meters. Even more importantly, it could be mass-produced easily using ordinary manufacturing facilities. German engineers immediately understood the significance of what they had discovered. So they did what German military industry often did best. They copied the idea, refined it, and created their own version. Within a few months, German factories began producing the Raketen Panzerbuchs 43, better known by its nickname, the Panzerschreck, meaning tank terror. The German version featured several improvements. Its warhead was increased from 60 millimeters to 88 millimeters, giving it significantly greater armor-piercing power. The Panzerschreck could penetrate around 160 millimeters of armor at 100 meters, compared to Bazooka's approximate penetration of 90 to 100 millimeters. On paper, the German weapon seemed technically superior. It had a larger warhead, greater destructive power, and reflected the precise engineering standards for which Germany was famous. However, hidden within those improvements was a problem the Germans did not fully anticipate. Wartime production records show that Germany manufactured roughly 289,000 Panzerschreck launchers throughout the entire conflict. That number might sound impressive at first, but when compared with American production, the difference becomes clear. By 1940, for the United States was manufacturing more than 20,000 bazookas every single month. By the end of the war, American factories had produced 476,628 bazookas and more than 15 million rockets. In other words, American industry was producing the weapon in enormous quantities while Germany struggled to match the scale. The bazooka's design required only about 2.5 man-hours to assemble, making it extremely efficient for mass production. The Panzerschreck required significantly more labor and resources. The cost difference reflected that reality as well. A bazooka cost around $25 to produce, while Panzerschreck cost roughly 70 Reichsmarks, more than twice as expensive. When you look at those numbers, a clear pattern begins to appear. It was the same pattern that ultimately shaped the entire outcome of the war. The power of simple designs, efficient production, and overwhelming industrial capacity. Germany focused on building the most advanced weapons, but the United States focused on building large numbers of weapons that were simple, reliable, and good enough. In many cases during the war, having thousands of solid weapons proved far more effective than having a smaller number of technically superior ones. But before that reality fully played out, we need to stay in North Africa during the spring of 1943. The disaster at Kasserine Pass forced the U.S. Army to face some hard truths, and the consequences of that defeat would shape the rest of the war in 2 very important ways. The first result was immediate and very visible. The American command structure had to change. General Lloyd Fredendall, whose poor leadership had contributed heavily to the disaster, was removed from command of the U.S. Second Corps. In his place arrived a very different kind of commander, General George S. Patton. Patton entered the situation with the energy of a storm and the personality of a man who refused to tolerate weakness. His aggressive leadership style shocked the demoralized American troops back into discipline and determination. Later, under leaders like Patton and General Omar Bradley, the same army that had been embarrassed at Kasserine Pass would transform into one of the most effective fighting forces in the world. The second result of the defeat was less obvious, but just as important. The near failure of the bazooka during its first appearance in combat revealed serious flaws in how the weapon had been introduced. Soldiers had received the launchers in sealed crates with no instructions, very little training, and unreliable ammunition. That situation forced the U.S. Army to rethink its entire process for deploying new equipment. Training programs were redesigned so soldiers would learn how to use the weapon before entering combat. Engineers improved the ammunition, replacing the unreliable M6 rocket with the much more dependable M6A1 model. The electrical contacts on the launcher were improved, and troops were given practical hands-on experience with the weapon. In short, the bazooka was given a second chance. When that second chance came, the result surprised the Germans in ways they had not expected. On paper, the German Panzerschreck launcher looked superior to the American bazooka. Its larger warhead could penetrate thicker armor and destroy heavier tanks. But real warfare is not fought on paper or inside technical manuals. Battles happen in mud, rain, ruined cities, forests, deserts, and freezing winter landscapes. In those harsh conditions, the simpler American weapon often had advantages that could not be measured by specifications alone. The Panzerschreck weighed more than 20 pounds even before its ammunition was added. Later versions also required a protective blast shield to protect the gunner from the weapon's powerful exhaust. Carrying it through rough terrain made it a heavy burden for an infantry squad. The bazooka, by comparison, usually weighed between 13 and 15 pounds depending on the model. Its rocket burned most of its fuel inside the launch tube, which meant the operator did not have to worry about dangerous exhaust blasting back toward him. Early Panzerschreck crews sometimes had to wear gas masks and protective clothing to avoid burns from their own weapon. The bazooka's design was cleaner, simpler, and far easier to use in real battlefield conditions. But the most important advantage of the bazooka was not weight or engineering. It was numbers. By 1944, American infantry battalions were equipped with between 24 and 36 bazookas. That meant almost every infantry squad could field a bazooka team if needed. In the countryside of France, where thick hedgerows lined narrow roads and fields, a German tank crew could never be sure where the next threat might appear. Every hedge, every ruined building, every patch of trees might hide a two-man team carrying a rocket launcher capable of destroying their vehicle. The Germans simply could not match that level of distribution. Their anti-tank weapons were effective, but they were not nearly as widespread. This overwhelming presence transformed the bazooka from a simple infantry weapon into something far more powerful, a psychological weapon. Fear plays a huge role in warfare. If a tank commander believes a bazooka might be hidden behind one particular hedge, he can plan around that risk. But if he believes there might be a bazooka behind every hedge, every doorway, and every ruined wall, then advancing becomes far more dangerous. That constant uncertainty slows movement, forces caution, and breaks the speed that armored warfare depends on. The Germans began to understand this reality during the summer of 1943 in a place where ancient ruins and modern combat met. The island of Sicily. On July 10, 1943, Allied forces launched Operation Husky, the massive invasion of Sicily. More than 160,000 Allied troops landed on the island's southern coast in one of the largest amphibious operations of the war. Among those soldiers were paratroopers from the U.S. 82nd Airborne Division. They carried the improved bazooka along with the more reliable M6A1 rockets. Waiting for them were elite German troops from the Hermann Göring Panzer Division, supported by powerful armored vehicles, including one of the most feared tanks of the entire war, the Tiger I. The Tiger was a terrifying machine. It weighed around 57 tons and carried an 88mm gun capable of destroying an American Sherman tank from more than 2,000 yards away. Its front armor was about 100mm thick, so strong that many Allied anti-tank guns could not penetrate it. Facing a Tiger in 1943 felt almost like confronting a prehistoric monster armed with modern weapons. Very few Allied ground weapons could reliably destroy from the front, yet under the right circumstances, even a bazooka could succeed. Near the town of Biscari in Sicily, a bazooka team from the 82nd Airborne achieved a shot that would later become famous among military historians. During a tense engagement, they fired at a Tiger tank and managed to strike the vehicle through the narrow driver's vision slot, a tiny opening in the armor barely wider than a man's hand. Hitting such a small target in the middle of combat was extraordinary. It was not something that happened often, and even the soldiers who witnessed it understood how rare such accuracy was. But the importance of the moment was not just the destruction of one tank. The real impact happened in the minds of German tank crews who heard about it afterward. The war diary of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division recorded a warning the following day that would have seemed impossible only months earlier. It stated that enemy infantry now possessed rocket weapons capable of destroying armored vehicles at distances between 100 and 150 meters. Because of this threat, German tank commanders were instructed to exercise greater caution, particularly in urban areas where infantry could hide easily. That statement reveals a remarkable shift in thinking. The German military, famous for fast and aggressive armor warfare, was now warning its tank crews to slow down and be careful around enemy infantry. Colonel James Gavin of the U.S. 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment later explained the deeper impact of the weapon. According to him, the bazooka had given American infantrymen something they previously lacked: confidence. In Sicily alone, American troops destroyed 17 German tanks using bazookas. Yet Gavin emphasized that the psychological effect of the weapon was even greater than the physical destruction it caused. The bazooka changed how soldiers felt when they saw enemy armor approaching. Before the bazooka existed, the appearance of enemy tanks often caused panic among infantry units because they had no reliable way to fight back. A column of German panzers approaching an infantry position often meant certain destruction. After the bazooka entered widespread use, the situation changed. Tanks were still dangerous, but they were no longer unstoppable. Infantry soldiers now had a weapon that allowed them to fight back. The battle might still be uneven and dangerous, but it was no longer hopeless. And that difference mattered more than any technical specification ever could. Human beings can endure a difficult fight. What they cannot endure is the feeling of complete helplessness. The Italian campaign that began in September 1943 changed the role of the bazooka in ways no one had originally anticipated, transforming it from a specialized anti-tank device into one of the most adaptable tools on the battlefield. Italy's harsh mountainous landscape and its maze of ancient stone towns created conditions that were nearly impossible for traditional military tactics, yet perfectly suited for small bazooka teams willing to improvise. In this environment, soldiers developed their own methods because the official manuals offered no guidance for the kind of combat they were facing. One of the most innovative tactics they created became known as mouse holing. Instead of advancing down streets exposed to machine gun fire, bazooka teams would blast a hole through the interior wall of the building, move directly into the next structure, and repeat the process, effectively progressing through entire blocks without ever stepping into the open. This approach minimized exposure and allowed infantry to bypass heavily defended streets. Reports from Allied units confirmed the effectiveness of this weapon in urban combat, noting its success against fortified houses, bunkers, machine gun nests, and defensive obstacles. What began as a weapon designed to defeat armored vehicles quickly proved capable of solving nearly any defensive challenge encountered in close-quarters fighting. Whether the problem involved removing a sniper position in a tall structure, breaching reinforced concrete positions, or creating emergency access through heavily defended terrain, the bazooka became the solution. A relatively inexpensive steel launcher, costing only a small amount compared to complex artillery systems, evolved into an incredibly versatile instrument of modern warfare. The impact did not go unnoticed by opposing forces. By late 1943, German military leadership had recognized the growing threat posed by handheld rocket launchers and issued formal directives adjusting armor tactics. These new guidelines required tanks to operate with close infantry protection in urban environments, mandated the clearing of all buildings before armored units advanced, and established safe distances from structures that had not yet been secured. Such instructions represented a significant shift from earlier confidence in rapid armored movement. Before widespread use of portable rocket launchers, German armored columns relied on speed, coordination, and shock tactics to overwhelm defenders. Tanks could move quickly through towns, using their armor to withstand small arms fire while maintaining momentum. This strategy, often described as lightning warfare, depended on rapid advances and constant pressure. However, the introduction of effective infantry-carried anti-tank weapons forced a re-evaluation of these principles. Armored units could no longer assume safe passage through built-up areas. Every building required inspection. Every corner posed potential danger, and every advance demanded careful coordination with supporting infantry. The result was a dramatic reduction in operational speed. What had once been minutes of movement now required extended preparation and systematic clearing operations. The psychological effect was equally significant. Speed turned into hesitation and confidence shifted toward caution. To counter the threat, tank crews began adding improvised protection, including welded track links, sandbags, and additional materials applied to vulnerable sections of their vehicles. In some cases, protective coatings were introduced to reduce the risk posed by specialized explosives designed to attach to armor. While these modifications offered limited additional security, they also increased weight, reduced maneuverability, and placed additional strain on already stretched mechanical systems. Tanks that had once operated efficiently now faced greater risk of breakdown and decreased performance. Each added layer of protection came at the expense of mobility, demonstrating how defensive adjustments could undermine offensive capability. The presence of portable rocket launchers did not merely eliminate individual vehicles. It altered the broader doctrine of armored warfare itself. Captured documents from German units later acknowledged that speed-based tactics were no longer practical under conditions where infantry support was mandatory and methodical clearing became essential. The principles that had defined early successes in mechanized warfare were effectively rewritten. The ultimate test of this weapon's influence arrived on June 6, 1944, during the massive Allied landing on the coast of Normandy. In this operation, more than 150,000 troops crossed the English Channel in an unprecedented amphibious assault aimed at establishing a foothold in Western Europe. Among the equipment carried ashore were thousands of bazookas, including improved models designed for easier transport, more reliable ignition systems, and enhanced sighting mechanisms. Unlike earlier deployments, the soldiers arriving in Normandy were extensively trained and familiar with their equipment. Confidence in the weapon had grown through experience in previous campaigns, and its effectiveness in close combat was well understood. The terrain they encountered in Normandy further amplified its value. The region's distinctive agricultural landscape, divided into small fields surrounded by thick, elevated hedgerows, created natural defensive positions. These hedgerows, composed of dense earth, roots, and vegetation, were often several feet tall and extremely difficult to penetrate. Visibility was limited from one field to the next, forcing armored vehicles to approach obstacles without knowing what lay beyond. Attempting to cross these barriers exposed vulnerable sections of tanks, making them susceptible to ambush. Behind each hedge, enemy infantry equipped with portable anti-tank weapons could conceal themselves, turning the environment into a series of interconnected defensive zones. In the weeks following the invasion, battlefield reports indicated that handheld rocket launchers were responsible for a significant portion of armored vehicle losses within the American operational sector. Although official statistics accounted for destroyed vehicles, the psychological impact extended even further. Many tanks were abandoned by their crews when the perceived risk of engaging enemy positions became too high. An intact vehicle left behind due to fear or tactical disadvantage would not appear in destruction records, yet it effectively removed itself from combat. After-action assessment from infantry divisions highlighted the effectiveness of bazooka teams operating within the hedgerow terrain, noting that enemy armored units increasingly required extensive reconnaissance and infantry support before attempting to advance. This hesitation represented a fundamental change in battlefield dynamics. Armored forces that once depended on rapid movement and overwhelming force were now compelled to proceed carefully, coordinating closely with supporting troops and accepting slower progress. The weapon's influence extended beyond physical destruction. It reshaped operational planning and reduced the effectiveness of previously dominant tactics. By forcing tanks to adapt, pause, and reconsider their movements, the bazooka played a role that far exceeded its modest size and cost. It did not single-handedly win battles, but it disrupted the confidence and rhythm of armored warfare, contributing to a broader transformation in how mechanized forces operated. From the urban streets of Italy to the hedgerows of Normandy, this small launcher demonstrated that innovation on the infantry level could influence large-scale strategy. Its presence altered enemy doctrine, slowed advances, increased caution, and forced structural changes in armor deployment. What began as a simple defensive tool evolved into a catalyst for tactical evolution, proving that adaptability and ingenuity could reshape even the most powerful military systems. German tank commanders who had endured 3 years of continuous warfare, men who had conquered Poland, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Yugoslavia, Greece, and driven far into the Soviet Union, were now slowing their advance and thinking twice before rolling their armored vehicles forward, all because of a simple steel launcher that cost less than a week's pay for a factory worker. The shift in battlefield power was undeniable. The pursuer had become the target. Yet the ultimate examination of bazookas still lay ahead. 6 months in the future, under the harshest possible circumstances. Deep winter snow, freezing temperatures well below zero, and dense fog that reduced visibility to a few dozen yards would combine with an enemy launching a desperate final offensive. The confrontation that would define this moment was approaching. The Battle of the Bulge. In the icy forests of the Ardennes, the bazooka would face conditions that would test both the weapon and the soldiers carrying it to their absolute limits. Among those soldiers was a 19-year-old private from Hullyville, New York, who would seize a bazooka during one of the most critical mornings of his life and use it to protect his entire unit. His name was Francis Curry, and his actions on December 21st, 1944, would later earn him the Medal of Honor. But before his heroism could unfold, the German offensive had to begin. On December 16th, 1944, at 5:30 in the morning, beneath the dark canopy of the Ardennes forest, nearly 200,000 German troops, supported by close to 1,000 tanks, surged forward through thick fog and struck a 75-mile stretch of American defenses held by only 4 divisions. Some of these units were worn down by previous combat, while others were newly arrived and inexperienced, having never faced battle. The campaign that followed became the largest and bloodiest single engagement fought by the United States during the entire war, and over the next 6 weeks more than 80,000 American soldiers would be wounded or killed. The German strategy was bold and ruthless. Break through thin American lines, race toward the Meuse River, seize the vital port of Antwerp, divide the Allied forces, and force negotiations in the West. It was a plan similar to the rapid success achieved in 1940 against France, and initially it appeared to have momentum. One of the earliest blows fell upon the 106th Infantry Division, a recently deployed unit that had reached the front only days before. 2 of its regiments were surrounded and compelled to surrender, resulting in over 8,000 American troops captured in one of the largest mass surrenders in U.S. military history. Soldiers such as John Jack McGee, serving in the 423rd Mortar Regiment, later recalled how the attack came swiftly and unexpectedly, with German forces advancing so close that the smell of fuel from enemy tanks filled the air and their movement could be heard in the darkness. Although popular memory of the Battle of the Bulge often highlights events such as the Siege of Bastogne, the famous response delivered by General McAuliffe and General Patton's rapid countermarch, the true outcome of the battle was shaped by countless smaller engagements at rural crossroads, isolated villages, and forest clearings, where individual soldiers chose to hold their ground despite overwhelming odds. In many of these encounters, the weapon that shifted the balance was a bazooka. One powerful example involved Private First Class Francis Curry, a 19-year-old automatic rifleman serving with Company K, 125th Infantry Regiment, 35th Infantry Division, positioned near Normandy, Belgium. On the morning of December 21st, 1944, German armored forces emerged through heavy fog and advanced toward his position in formation. Multiple tanks moved forward together, their engines roaring and tracks grinding through snow, while machine guns fired and artillery shells exploded around American defenses. Curry and his squad were pinned down, and 5 of his fellow soldiers were trapped inside a nearby structure under heavy fire. The tanks continued closing in, creating a situation where infantry without heavy weapons would normally be overwhelmed by armor in open terrain. However, Curry located a bazooka and, despite direct enemy fire, moved into an exposed position. He fired at the first tank and succeeded in disabling it, forcing its crew to abandon the vehicle. After securing additional rockets, he reloaded and engaged 2 more tanks, ultimately compelling 4 armored crews to evacuate their machines through a combination of bazooka fire and anti-tank grenades. In total, 4 tanks capable of destroying his entire company were rendered ineffective by a single 19-year-old soldier armed with a portable launcher. Following this extraordinary action, Curry proceeded to rescue the 5 trapped comrades. He was later awarded the Medal of Honor on July 27, 1945, becoming one of the youngest recipients of the conflict. Yet he was only one example among many. The winter campaign in the Ardennes placed immense strain on the weapon itself. Temperatures fell to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, causing mechanical issues with the older M1 bazooka models that relied on battery-powered ignition systems. Soldiers adapted by keeping batteries inside their clothing to preserve warmth, installing them only moments before firing. Cold weather also affected rocket performance, altering burn characteristics and reducing consistency in range and accuracy. Combat distances were extremely short, often within 75 yards, and sometimes even closer, 50 yards or less. Engagements frequently occurred at such proximity that soldiers could see enemy crew members inside their vehicles before firing. This demanded extraordinary discipline and courage. From frozen foxholes, troops waited for armored vehicles weighing dozens of tons to approach within range, knowing that a missed shot might leave no opportunity for a second attempt. The psychological pressure was immense, as the decision to fire had to be made at precisely the right moment, often when survival depended on a single trigger pull. At that moment, the soldier had to rise from cover, expose himself to enemy machine gun fire, take careful aim at vulnerable sections of an armored vehicle, such as the rear engine compartment, the thinner side plating, or the junction around the turret, and then fire, hoping the rocket functioned properly and that his hands, numb by freezing temperatures and shaken by fear, would not cause him to miss. Records from the 18th Airborne Corps indicate that during the Battle of the Bulge, bazooka teams were responsible for disabling or destroying 89 German armored vehicles, an achievement accomplished under extreme weather conditions that pushed both equipment and personnel to their limits. Yet beyond the statistics, there remains another story from the war, so inventive and bold that it seems fictional, though it is entirely real. The man at the center of it was Major Charles Carpenter, a former high school history teacher from Illinois who enlisted in 1942 at the age of 30. Assigned to fly an L-4 Grasshopper, a small observation aircraft based on the civilian Piper Cub and used for reconnaissance and artillery spotting. Carpenter found himself in an unarmored plane constructed largely of fabric and lightweight tubing. The aircraft's harmless appearance gave it little defensive value, and Carpenter believed this limitation was unacceptable in a combat environment. While stationed in France in the autumn of 1944, with assistance from ground crew and a technical specialist, he modified his aircraft by attaching 6 M1A1 bazookas, 3 beneath each wing strut, and connecting them to cockpit switches so they could be fired in sequence. This transformation turned a slow, lightly built observation plane into a makeshift tank hunter. Imagine the scene: a fabric-covered aircraft capable of reaching only modest speeds, piloted by a former classroom instructor, diving toward German armored formations protected by machine guns and anti-aircraft defenses, all while carrying rockets designed for ground combat. Carpenter's method involved locating enemy tank columns in the air, descending rapidly through defensive fire, approaching at extremely low altitude, and firing rockets at the thinner upper armor tanks before climbing away as German weapons responded with concentrated fire. He named the aircraft Rosie the Rocketer, and wartime record from the 4th Armored Division confirmed its operations. On September 20th, 1944, during the Battle of Ericourt, Carpenter attacked a German armored formation, launching numerous rockets in repeated passes. Witnesses observed the small aircraft repeatedly diving into enemy formations, surprising both German forces and nearby American units. By the end of the war, official assessments credited him with destroying 6 tanks, qualifying him as a tank ace, while some accounts suggest the total may have been higher. All of this was accomplished from a lightweight observation plane armed with rocket launchers. Carpenter later described how enemy forces began responding to his presence with intense fire, noting that what was once ignored had become a serious threat in the eyes of the opposition. After the war concluded, he returned to Illinois and resumed his profession as a history teacher, and he passed away in 1966 at the age of 53. Many years later, his aircraft was rediscovered in an Austrian aviation collection and eventually restored and brought back to the United States. His story, combining a civilian educator, a fragile aircraft, improvised rocket weaponry, and extraordinary bravery, illustrates the essence of the bazooka phenomenon: simplicity combined with determination and willingness to innovate under pressure. Yet the full significance of the bazooka extended far beyond dramatic individual actions or battlefield heroics. Its broader impact lay in strategic and economic consequences that influenced the overall outcome of the war. To understand this, one must examine the financial realities of industrial warfare, where production capacity and cost efficiency often determine victory. The bazooka represented not only a tactical tool, but also a powerful economic equalizer. A comparison of costs reveals its extraordinary advantage. Destroying a German tank using American tanks required significant losses, with multiple Shermans typically sacrificed for each enemy vehicle eliminated. Given the price of each Sherman tank, the total expenditure to eliminate one German armored unit through tank combat reached well over $100,000. Using dedicated anti-tank artillery reduced costs somewhat, but still required tens of thousands of dollars in equipment, training, and logistics. Air power was effective but involved substantial expenses for aircraft production, pilot training, fuel, ordnance, and replacement losses. In contrast, defeating a tank with bazooka teams generally required only a few inexpensive rockets and, occasionally, replacement launchers, bringing the average cost per successful engagement to roughly a few dozen dollars. When comparing these figures, the disparity becomes astonishing. For the cost of producing a single medium tank, thousands of bazookas and tens of thousands of rockets could be manufactured, each capable of threatening or destroying heavily armored vehicles. This economic asymmetry meant that the financial burden of armored warfare shifted dramatically. Every expensive tank produced by Germany could be countered with relatively minimal expenditure, creating a cost imbalance that favored the Allies. Throughout the war, Germany produced only a limited number of its heaviest tanks, constrained by resources and industrial capacity, while Allied production systems generated vast quantities of portable anti-armor weapons. This difference in scalability turned the bazooka into more than a battlefield instrument. It became a symbol of mass production applied to combat efficiency. In the larger context of the conflict, the ability to field inexpensive yet effective infantry weapons meant that armored superiority alone could no longer guarantee success. The combination of tactical flexibility, economic efficiency, and widespread deployment allowed Allied forces to neutralize enemy armor without matching it tank for tank. In this sense, the bazooka was not merely a weapon but a demonstration of how industrial capacity and practical innovation could reshape modern warfare. Its influence reached beyond individual engagements, altering strategy, undermining armored doctrine, and contributing to the overall balance of power that ultimately led to Allied victory. Now consider the full scale of production, because the numbers themselves tell an extraordinary story. By the end of the war, American industry had manufactured approximately 112,790 of the original M1 launchers, around 60,000 M1A1 units, about 27,000 M9 models, nearly 277,800 improved M9A1 versions, and roughly 500 of the lightweight aluminum M18 variant introduced in the final months of the conflict, bringing total launcher production to 476,628 units. Even more staggering was rocket output. More than 15 million rounds were produced, each costing roughly $8 during peak manufacturing. In March 1945 alone, factories were turning out approximately 42,000 launchers monthly and over 500,000 rockets per month. Production was spread across 237 subcontractors in 34 different states, creating a decentralized industrial network so resilient that no single bombing campaign could have seriously disrupted supply. This stood in sharp contrast to German manufacturing, which relied on more centralized facilities that Allied air power was able to strike effectively. When comparing output, Germany's comparable handheld anti-tank weapon, the Panzerfaust, reached approximately 289,000 units over the entire war, less than two-thirds of American launcher production. Moreover, the German system was generally more complex, heavier to carry, and required greater caution due to its dangerous backblast. Meanwhile, the American weapon was distributed widely through Allied supply agreements, reaching numerous nations. Tens of thousands were delivered to Free French forces, thousands more to the Soviet Union, and additional quantities to Britain, Canada, China, Brazil, and other Allied partners. The effect was transformative. Anti-tank warfare was no longer limited to specialized units or heavy vehicles. Before this shift, stopping a tank typically required another tank, large artillery, or extreme personal sacrifice. After widespread deployment of portable rocket launchers, two soldiers with minimal training and the right opportunity could threaten the most advanced armored vehicles in existence. The influence of this concept extended far beyond the war itself. Modern infantry anti-armor systems used by dozens of countries trace their lineage to this design philosophy, including later lightweight launchers and recoilless rifles. Whenever a contemporary conflict shows a soldier carrying a shoulder-fired tube weapon, it reflects a foundational idea introduced during this era. Even former German military leaders acknowledged this change. Post-war writings by senior architects of armored doctrine admitted that the widespread availability of infantry anti-tank weapons fundamentally undermined the independence of armored formations that had once been central to their strategy. The concept of fast-moving, self-sufficient tank columns breaking through enemy lines, so successful in the early years of the war, could no longer operate without close infantry coordination because handheld rocket weapons made isolated armor vulnerable. Other senior commanders echoed this conclusion, stating that the speed-based shock tactics that had achieved major victories at the beginning of the conflict were no longer effective under the threat posed by infantry-equipped forces. Even military museums in Germany later included the American launcher in permanent exhibits on anti-armor warfare, acknowledging in official displays that this simple, inexpensive system had reshaped battlefield dynamics and neutralized previous armored superiority. That recognition, coming from former adversaries, underscores the magnitude of its impact. Returning to where this story began, one can recall the moment in the early 1950s when Allied leadership summarized the principal instruments of victory. Alongside mobility vehicles, transport aircraft, and strategic deterrence, the portable rocket launcher was included as one of the key contributors. Each tool served a distinct purpose. Vehicles provided movement, aircraft ensured supply and coordination, strategic weapons delivered ultimate deterrence, but the bazooka offered something different. It empowered the individual soldier directly. Before its widespread use, a lone infantryman confronting a tank had little chance of survival. Afterward, that same soldier, properly trained and equipped, could defeat armored vehicles under the right conditions. Armored warfare ceased to be an exclusive contest between machines and became accessible to ordinary troops armed with portable technology. This represented a democratization of battlefield power, placing the ability to challenge the enemy's most expensive equipment into the hands of standard rifle units. The development followed a clear progression. A young officer discovered an improvised solution from discarded materials. Military leadership recognized its value and ordered mass production. Factories across the country scaled up output. Soldiers learned to employ it in North Africa under difficult circumstances. Battlefield experience refined its use in Italy, France, Belgium, and Germany. And individuals in pivotal moments demonstrated its effectiveness in combat, from aerial adaptations to winter engagements in harsh terrain. From improvised beginnings to industrial-scale deployment, the weapon's journey reflected the broader story of the war itself. Innovation amplified by production and sustained by determination. The opposing side entered the conflict with highly regarded armored forces that had achieved rapid victories early on, yet those same formations eventually faced widespread resistance from inexpensive, portable systems carried by ordinary infantry. In the end, it was not advanced engineering alone that determined outcomes, but the combination of simplicity, scalability, and the belief that well-equipped individuals could influence events far beyond their size. The bazooka's legacy lies not merely in its technical design, but in how it altered expectations, changing armored warfare, empowering infantry, and symbolizing the moment when industrial capacity and accessible innovation reshaped the balance of power. It was more than a weapon. It marked a shift in the rules of engagement, and by the time that shift became clear to the enemy, the transformation was already irreversible.